Understanding MCP without understanding the architecture is just like driving a supercar, but you doesn't know what is happening under the hood. So it will work sometimes, but you will truly never able to understand MCP. So let's break down MCP architecture in this lecture. So MCP architecture is basically composed of three important things. So the first part of MCP architecture is basically MCP host. So MCP host is nothing but the AI application that you use. So let's say Cursor, Claude, GitHub Copilot, or any MCP host inside your editor. Let's say in your VS Code you are using Cursor or Claude. So that all is actually called as MCP host or MCP client or AI application. So the first part of the architecture is this. Now let's see the second important part of MCP architecture, and this is basically called as MCP server. So what is a MCP server? So let's say if your MCP host wanted to access a external system, so it will not directly call the external system, it will call a server which is called as MCP server. So MCP server is actually a middleware between your MCP client or MCP host and your external system. Now the third important part of the architecture is your external system or services. So this is the whole architecture of MCP server. Let's say you are seeing in my screen, let's say you have a Claude app, right? So that is your MCP host, and you type your Claude app like, I want to count all the emails that come to me yesterday. Then what will happen is, instead of directly the MCP host directly calling to Gmail app, it will call to the MCP server. Then MCP server will fetch the data from the Gmail, and all the business logic is actually written in the MCP server, and then it will return the count of all the emails that come yesterday, and then your MCP client, which is basically your Claude app, will show to you. Now one thing guys, I just wanted to tell all of you is that the first part that I talked about, MCP host or MCP client or AI application, these are actually the aliases of each other, and these are exactly the same. So whenever I'm talking about MCP client or MCP host or AI application, it actually means the same, right? Now let's understand more about MCP server, because it is doing everything, right? Your MCP host is just like UI, that we are already aware of, and your external system is Slack, Gmail, and DB. That is totally fine. So let's understand about this MCP server a little bit more. So what is exactly a MCP server? So if you go to the official documentation, and if you go to the website modelcontextprotocol.io, the official documentation says that MCP servers are the programs that expose capabilities to AI applications through standardized protocol interface. So from this definition, we can just see like MCP servers are the programs, right? And it exposes some capabilities. So what capability is exposing? In our case, one MCP server is exposing a capability of Slack. One MCP server is exposing a capability of Gmail. One MCP server is exposing a capability of DB. And it is exposing to whom? So it is exposing to our AI applications. So MCP hosts are basically the AI applications, that is like Cursor, Claude, or GitHub Copilot, that are basically the AI application. And how it exposes it? So basically MCP server exposes this capability through a standard protocol, and that standard protocol is actually called as MCP protocol, right? So now we all understand a little bit about MCP server from our diagram and from also the standard definition or the official definition. Now the next part we should understand is in little bit much more depth is like how a MCP host and a MCP server connect with each other, like what protocol it use, how it communicate through each other. So basically whenever a MCP host is there, let's say Claude, Cursor, or GitHub Copilot, it basically connect to MCP server via two communication protocol. Like it can use two type of protocol. The first protocol that it can use is basically stdio. So what here stdio is basically the std in and std out pipes that I'm talking about. So I will tell you later, just in a moment, like when it will use this protocol, right? Now the second type through which, the second way through which a MCP host can communicate with your MCP server is basically via HTTP protocol. Now let's see a word here, a word that is written here, streamable HTTP. What is this means? Is it different than normal HTTP? So yes. So basically, just give you a small background about it. So HTTP is basically a application layer protocol which is used for communication over the internet, right? Now in HTTP there is one capability. You can enable HTTP and you can also enable server side event. So when you enable server side event over HTTP, what really happens is, this is the second thing in HTTP, what really happens is it will establish a two-way communication between your client and your server. So let's say, right, you can use your HTTP to get from your client, you can call to a server, right? But if you want to do a bi-directional communication with HTTP, you can enable server side events, and then your client can call to server and your server can also call your client, and it will become a bi-directional communication. So what they did in MCP is they basically have taken the HTTP protocol and they have combined the server side event, and by combining these two they say a new word, streamable HTTP. So streamable HTTP is nothing but HTTP plus server side event. Now one more thing to add here just for info is this server side event is optional. What I mean is, as you can see in my screen, that if a MCP host is communicating to a MCP server, it can communicate via HTTP. But if they want to establish a two-way communication, they can also enable server-side event, and that is totally optional. If they don't enable it, it's fine. If they really enable it, then that is also fine. And then at that time, the MCP host and MCP server can both communicate with each other in a bi-directional way, right? Now basically, let's see when we should use stdio and when we should use this streamable HTTP. Streamable HTTP is basically HTTP plus SSC optional. SSC is optional here, right? So stdio is used, let's say you have a MCP host and you basically want to spin up a MCP server that is in your local, and then you want to access, let's say, local files. Let's say in your cursor you have said, can you list me how many files are there at this path? So what happens is at that time is your MCP host is there, that is, let's say, cursor, and it will basically spin up a sub process, and that sub process is basically a MCP server, and to communicate to that MCP server, it will use the std in and std out pipe. Now one more thing that is coming here is that when they communicate with each other, this is actually standard. When they communicate with each other, they use a messaging format, and that messaging format is called as JSON RPC. So now I'm a little bit confused. I'm confused, like in the previous slide you have talked about we use stdio and streamable HTTP. So what is this JSON RPC? So when we talk about MCP protocol, it is actually made up of two things. The first thing is the messaging format. If we are using a messaging format called as JSON RPC, and if we are using a communication protocol that is called as stdio, by combining these two, it will become a MCP protocol. We have seen the definition, right? That MCP server expose the capabilities through a standardized protocol, and that protocol is called as MCP protocol, and that MCP protocol is basically made up of JSON RPC plus stdio, or there can be a second way also, that MCP protocol is also when we use JSON RPC plus streamable HTTP. The both combination can exist. So basically what I mean here is, whenever there is a MCP host and it communicates to a MCP server and the host and the server is both present on the same machine locally, they basically communicate it through stdio, because they don't used to need HTTP, right? They are not over the internet, and they use basically JSON RPC for messaging flow between the host and the server, and basically after that the MCP server will reach to a file system. So now you got a little bit of idea. Let's say whenever you ask your cursor like list these many files in this path, then cursor behind the scene actually launches a MCP server, and they both communicate it via the stdio communication protocol, and they use the JSON RPC as a messaging format, and then they communicate to the external system, right? Now I just want to focus one more thing about it. What is this JSON RPC? So if you are not aware about it, just think it like in JSON RPC we use JSON as a messaging format, and we use a standard which is called as remote procedure call. In this lecture we are not going to cover this in detail, but think it like it is very similar to JSON with REST APIs. So if you have heard about REST APIs, right, and they use JSON to communicate between client and server, and on the top of that they use the HTTP protocol or whatever protocol they are using, right? So this is very similar to that. So if you want to read about JSON RPC, I will share the reference in the later section of this video, and you can go through it and you can understand it in much more detail, right? Now, okay, fine, we got the idea when we should use stdio. Now when we should use basically streamable HTTP, let's say, right, I have told you we have two types of communication protocol. So whenever there is a MCP host and that MCP host is basically connecting to a remote MCP server, I mean host is present in one machine and MCP server is present somewhere in the internet, not on that machine, then you will use basically the protocol that is called as HTTP protocol. Basically it will communicate by using the same messaging format that is called as JSON RPC, right? And one more thing I just wanted to tell you, and people get confused a little bit. They always think like whenever you are connecting from MCP host to remote MCP server, you always has to do a HTTP post request using JSON RPC, but that's not right. A client, a MCP host or MCP client can also do a HTTP get call to basically establish a server side stream. So this is one thing just I wanted to add. So don't always think like every time your MCP client will do a HTTP post call only by using JSON RPC. That's not the case. It can do a get call as well, right? And in response, let's say whenever you are doing call to a MCP server can respond in three different ways, right? The first way is it can basically return the JSON RPC is just returning a JSON over RPC. So just think it like it is returning a JSON simply. So it can return a JSON over HTTP. Second thing, it can return the JSON over SSC stream as well. And third thing, it can basically doesn't return any body and it will just return 202 status code. Now all this scenario we are going to see in the later part of this video only via an example. So just don't get confused, and just remember like whenever a client is calling to MCP server, it can be a post call or a get call, and the server can respond either a JSON via HTTP or a JSON via SSC, or basically it can basically respond a empty body with 202 status code. Now after that we are going to understand some conditions right? That whenever MCP host is calling to a MCP remote server, there are some conditions that MCP host has to follow, right? 99% of the time people don't realize it, but I'm just teaching you so that it will create a very good understanding like how really a MCP host is connecting to a MCP remote server via this HTTP or streamable HTTP protocol. So what are the conditions whenever a MCP host is calling a MCP server that is basically a remote via streamable HTTP? So the first condition is whenever a client is sending a post request, it should HTTP post request via JSON RPC, it should always send to /MCP endpoint. Like that is basically the standard, and every time a client send a call to MCP server, it will always send to /MCP endpoint, and after that it can have some prefix as well, but /MCP endpoint is mandatory, right? Now the next part is you will ask like it can give a get call as well, then the get call should also be at the /MCP endpoint, right? Now the next condition is whenever a client is sending a request to the MCP server, right? I have told you, right? Either you can use HTTP or you can use SSC as well. So the client header, there is a accept header, right? This is a general header in communication protocol. So this accept header should include both application JSON or and text event /stream. So let's say MCP server wanted to respond via HTTP only. So it knows, right, that your client accept the application JSON, so I can return the data. And let's say your MCP server wanted to return something via SSC. Let's say you have enabled SSC in MCP server, and MCP server wanted to return that in by using SSC. So it will use the text/event stream, and it knows that okay, my client can accept it, so I can return the data with this format as well, like by using SSC as well. Now the third important condition that is there is whenever this is a little bit confusing, that's why focus attention here. This is actually a little bit confusing. Whenever a client is sending a post request to basically a MCP server, there are three types of post requests that it can send. Like it, of course, it will send the post request to /MCP endpoint. It will include the header that we got it. But there are basically three types through which it can send a post request. The first type is basically called as request. What it means is a client is sending a request to a MCP server and it is saying like I want a reply, I want something in body. So that is called as request. The second type is the client is sending a request, MCP client is sending a request to MCP server and it is saying like I don't want a body and I want only 202 status code, and that is called as notification. And the third type is called as response. What it means here is, let's say server has sent something to our MCP host via SSC, and server say I want this, and then your client is responding with the reply. So that is basically called as response, right? Now you are all thinking about it like why there are these three type of requests, because whenever a MCP host is connecting with MCP server, there can be a scenarios where a client need something specific, right? Or client want to, let's say, notify something, or server wants something. Then basically I told you, right, MCP host and MCP server, whenever they are communicating with each other, if they are using HTTP plus SSC, it's basically a bi-directional communication. If you have only enabled HTTP, then the third type, let's say response, can't happen, right? I mean, server can't reach to client, so that is not possible. But if you are using just HTTP, then also the case A, I mean request and notification is possible, right? So now let us understand this with an example, whatever we have studied, and then after seeing the example, things will actually make much more sense to all of you, right? So the first thing, that I really wanted to introduce a term called as ID. So whenever a MCP host or MCP client communicate with MCP server, it basically communicates using a field in it. That field is called as ID, and this is very important field, right? This field actually tells what behavior client want from MCP server. Let's see in a minute, right? So think it like this: ID is just like a magic wand which is doing all the magic between your MCP client and your MCP server. So let's say MCP client is there. What is an MCP client? Cursor, Claude, or GitHub Copilot, right? Very simple. So let's say your MCP client is there, and let's say the MCP client is Cursor, Claude, whatever you want to assume, right? You assume it by yourself. So let's say MCP client is there and it is sending a post request. So now it is sending a post request to /MCP endpoint. Okay, it has actually the first condition that we have seen, it has actually satisfied that. Now the second condition is, whenever a MCP client is sending a request, it must send the accept header, and it should accept both application JSON or text event stream, so that MCP server can respond via HTTP or via SSC, right? Now you can see it here. It has sent the accept header, and now you can see in the content type it has sent, like it is using a messaging format JSON RPC 2.0 that we have already studied. Like whenever MCP host communicates with MCP server, it uses the messaging format that is JSON RPC, and then it sends the ID. So whenever it sends the ID, it will become a request. It means that MCP client is expecting a reply with body, right? And then it has sent some data, right? With let's say in parameters you have seen, like it is sending some data, right? Now the MCP server can reply in two ways. The first way, it can reply with JSON over HTTP, right? So you can see it here. It is replying with content type JSON, and it is giving some result. It is giving the data in that result, right, with the ID one. Or the second thing, the server can reply with basically JSON only, but then it use SSC, like it is using SSC. So it is using the combination of HTTP plus SSC. SSC is nothing but, whenever SSC is enabled, I have already told you, we use behind the scene HTTP only, but when SSC is enabled, then it's a bi-directional communication between the client and the server. So now here you can see the content type is text/event stream, and the MCP server is replying with the result only, and it is saying like I'm using the JSON RPC 2.0 format, ID is 1, and from the result it is actually replying with the result, right? So now you got the idea, right? Whenever the ID is present, your MCP server can reply either with simple HTTP with JSON data, or it can reply with SSC with JSON data only, right? Now let's say there is a situation where your MCP client want to notify something to MCP server. It doesn't want the data, right? So what at that time happen is, it will not send any ID. It will just send it will do a post call at /MCP endpoint, and it will send the data, and you can see it here. When it is sending the data, there is basically no ID present, and then at that time the MCP server will actually reply like, okay, I got it, I got whatever you want to send, and it just reply with 202 status code, like whatever you want to inform me, MCP server say I got informed, and now just this is the acknowledgement that I got it, right? Now the third scenario is, let's say server asks something to MCP server. You have SSC enabled, and server has sent something like, I want this from the client to process something. Then at that time MCP client will send the data with ID only, and whatever the data it wanted to share, and at that time the server reply with 202. Just I wanted to tell you, and don't again get confused, the request and response look same, but request is the scenario where client is asking something from the server, and response is a scenario where server has asked something and client is just sending the data, right? So this is a place where people get generally very confused, like they mix up request and response, but they don't realize it. Like request is basically nothing but client is asking something from the server, and that's why it send the ID. And in response is something when SSC is enabled, and uh, if SSC is not enabled, then response will not happen, right? Server will not able to ask anything to the client, right? But let's say if SSC is enabled, then at that time server has said something and then client replied with the response, right? Yeah, so that's why the server said 202, because it said okay fine, I got the data that I wanted, right? Now I just wanted to share two important references with you. Let's say if you want to learn about JSON RPC 2.0, you can go to this website www.jsonrpc.org/specification, and you can go through it and understand it, like how JSON RPC really works and how JSON RPC is different than JSON with REST APIs. Like both are sharing data with JSON only, but the specifications are different. The REST API specifications are different and the RPC specifications are different, but both of them beneath the hood use HTTP protocol only, right? Now the second reference I just wanted to tell you, let's say you wanted to read more about it, like how a MCP host interact with MCP server, then you can go to this specific page, that is modalcontext-protocol.io/specification/2025/1125/basic/transports, and here you will able to learn more about stdio and streamable HTTP. Right? So if you really have the curiosity and you really want to deep dive more, this is the very two important links that you can follow, right? Now before going ahead in this slide, I just wanted to tell you, like whatever I told you, the internals 99% of the time it is not used, right? But I think it's important to know, so that whenever we are developing MCP, we are very much confident, like internally, why this thing is happening in this way, right? So what's next, right? So in the next lecture, we are going to start our MCP building, right? We want to build our custom MCP via Golang. But the thing is, before building a MCP server, we should know some more things about MCP server. So we should just go and understand about MCP server a little bit more, and then after that we will start building our own MCP server. After this, I just wanted to tell all of you guys is really thank you, and if you have any doubts or you are confused, you can comment it and you can reach out to me. And if you really find this lecture little bit difficult, I will suggest, like you can go through it again and understand it little by little. So thanks a lot, and really thank you for your precious time in DeeperBits. Thank you.